The stagecoach rattled across the endless prairie, its wooden wheels groaning over every rut in the dusty trail. Inside, 5 weary passengers shifted in their seats as the afternoon sun streamed through the small windows. The air smelled of leather, dust, and horses, while every bump reminded them how far they had traveled across the American West. Clara Whitmore sat quietly in the corner. She kept both hands folded around a small, well-worn Bible whose edges had softened from years of use. It had belonged to her mother, and it was the one possession she treasured above all others. On the seat beside her rested a faded carpet bag containing a few dresses, sewing needles, family photographs, and a simple silver locket. Everything else she owned was packed inside a weathered trunk strapped to the roof of the coach. She had left Boston nearly 3 weeks earlier. Nearly 2,000 miles separated her from the quiet streets where she had spent her entire life caring for her aging parents. Now both of them were gone. Her father had passed during the previous winter after a long illness. Her mother followed him only 6 months later, leaving Clara completely alone in the world. For many nights she had prayed for direction. She had no brothers, no sisters, no home she could afford, no promise of work. Then one afternoon, while reading the newspaper at the church mission, she noticed a small advertisement. Respectable ranch owner in Montana Territory seeks God-fearing wife, honest intentions only, comfortable home, reply with photograph and letter. She almost ignored it. Marriage to a stranger seemed frightening. Yet every woman she trusted at church told her the same thing. Sometimes the Lord opens a door where we least expect it. So she prayed again. Then she wrote the letter. She told the rancher everything that mattered. She loved cooking. She could sew nearly anything by hand. She knew how to preserve food through harsh winters. She enjoyed reading scripture every evening. She believed a strong marriage was built on faith, honesty, patience, and hard work, rather than romance alone. Weeks later, his reply arrived. His name was Harold Granger. His handwriting was neat. His words were confident. Miss Whitmore, your letter speaks of kindness more than beauty. That is exactly the sort of wife I desire. I await your arrival in Silver Creek. Those words had filled her heart with hope. Perhaps, after all the loneliness, God truly had prepared a new beginning. The stagecoach lurched suddenly, pulling Clara back to the present. Across from her, a cheerful older woman smiled. You must be nervous. Clara returned the smile. A little. Meeting your future husband. Yes. First time in the West. Clara nodded. I've never been farther than New York before this. The woman laughed softly. Well, Montana isn't New York. Several passengers chuckled. A gray-bearded man tipped his hat. Out here, folks judge a body by whether they work hard. Clara hoped that would prove true. The scar on her left cheek had troubled her since childhood. When she was 9 years old, a frightened horse had kicked open a stable gate. A jagged piece of wood struck her face before anyone could pull her away. The wound healed. The scar remained. It wasn't large. It wasn't terribly disfiguring. Yet many people noticed it before anything else. Children sometimes stared. Ladies whispered. Young men often looked away after seeing it. Over time, Clara learned to ignore their reactions. Her mother had always brushed a hand across her daughter's cheek and said, "Beauty fades with every passing year, but kindness only grows brighter." Those words had become part of Clara's heart. Still, as the stagecoach rolled farther west, doubt quietly returned. Would Harold care about the scar? She had enclosed a photograph with her letter. But the picture had been taken nearly 6 years earlier. The lighting had hidden most of the mark. She had never meant to deceive him. The photographer simply chose the angle. Would he think she had lied? She whispered a silent prayer. Lord, if this path is from you, please give me courage. If it is not, help me trust you anyway. The coach continued climbing toward the mountains. Outside, the landscape changed. Rolling grasslands slowly gave way to towering pine forests. Crystal streams sparkled beneath wooden bridges. Snow still crowned the distant mountain peaks, despite the warmth below. Clara pressed her hand against the window. She had never imagined anything so beautiful. "It feels like another world," she whispered. "It is," replied the driver from outside, after overhearing her. "Montana has a way of changing people." Hours later, the stagecoach rounded one final bend. The town of Silver Creek appeared below. It wasn't large. A single dusty main street stretched between rows of wooden buildings. The church steeple rose above the rooftops. Children chased one another outside the schoolhouse. Blacksmith hammers rang through the afternoon air. Smoke drifted lazily from cabin chimneys. To Clara, it looked like hope. She quietly straightened her plain blue traveling dress. She adjusted her bonnet. She smoothed nervous wrinkles from her gloves. Then she reached into her bag and touched her mother's locket. "I wish you could see this," she whispered. The stagecoach rolled into town. Almost immediately, people began gathering. Word had spread days earlier that Harold Granger's mail-order bride would arrive today. Shopkeepers stepped outside. Cowboys leaned against hitching posts. Ladies paused in the middle of their conversations. Even children stopped playing. Everyone wanted to see the woman who had traveled across America to become the wealthy rancher's wife. Among them stood Harold himself. He was well-dressed. His polished boots reflected sunlight. His dark coat fit perfectly. His expensive silver watch chain hung proudly across his vest. Several friends stood beside him. One elbowed another. "I hear she's from Boston. They say Eastern women are refined." Harold finally found himself a proper lady. Harold smiled confidently. "I expect she has excellent manners." One man laughed. "And hopefully she's pretty." Harold answered with a grin. "I certainly won't complain." The stagecoach came to a stop. The driver climbed down first. He untied the luggage. Passengers slowly began stepping onto the street. An elderly couple. A traveling salesman. A young mother carrying her sleeping child. Then, Clara appeared in the doorway. She carefully stepped down, her boots touching Montana soil for the first time. For one brief moment, the entire street fell silent. She looked exactly as her letter had described. Simple, modest, graceful. But then the afternoon sun shifted. Its light fell across the left side of her face. The small scar became visible. The silence changed. Someone whispered, "Oh." Another voice quietly muttered, "Is that the bride? I thought she'd be prettier." A young cowboy smirked. "Guess the picture was generous." Soft laughter spread through the crowd. Clara heard every word. Her fingers tightened around her Bible. She lifted her chin anyway. She had not traveled 2,000 miles to run from whispers. Harold walked toward her. For a brief second she smiled with genuine relief. At last, the man who had written such thoughtful letters. The man who promised a fresh beginning. She extended her hand politely. "Mr. Granger? I'm Clara Whitmore." Instead of shaking her hand, Harold simply stared. His eyes lingered on the scar. His smile slowly disappeared. "You." He paused. "Don't look exactly like your photograph." Clara's heart sank. "It was taken several years ago. You failed to mention this." His finger gestured toward her cheek. She instinctively touched the scar. "I never thought it mattered." His face hardened. "It matters." The crowd grew quiet again. Harold lowered his voice, though everyone could still hear. "I expected honesty. I was honest. You weren't complete. I never tried to deceive you. But you did." A few men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others simply watched. Clara swallowed hard. "I came because you invited me." Harold sighed impatiently. "I've changed my mind." Her breath caught. "I beg your pardon? I won't marry you." The words echoed across the silent street. Someone laughed. Another shook his head. One woman whispered to her friend, "What a shame." A cowboy muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. He paid for a wife, not a disappointment. More laughter followed. Clara felt heat rush into her face. Not because of anger, because of humiliation. Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give the crowd that satisfaction. Harold reached for her suitcase. He placed it back into her hands. "I'll pay for one night's room at the hotel." She looked at him. "What happens tomorrow?" He shrugged. "I suppose that's your concern." Without another word, he turned and walked away. His friends followed. The crowd slowly scattered. Within minutes, the busy street returned to normal. Only Clara remained standing beside her trunk, completely alone. Thousands of miles from home. No husband, no family, very little money. No idea where she would sleep after tomorrow. She looked toward the mountains rising beyond the town. For the first time since leaving Boston, fear settled deeply into her heart. She whispered so softly that only God could hear. "Father, I thought this was the path you opened." A gentle voice answered from behind her. "My dear." Clara turned. An elderly woman with kind grey eyes stood there, carrying a basket of fresh bread. "My name is Martha Jenkins." She smiled warmly. "You look like someone who could use a hot meal." Clara tried to answer. Instead, tears finally escaped down her cheeks. Martha gently embraced her without another word. From the ridge high above Silver Creek, another pair of eyes had witnessed everything. A tall, broad-shouldered mountain man sat quietly upon a dark bay horse. His long coat stirred in the wind. A full beard shadowed his face. He had ridden into town to trade beaver pelts and purchase flour before returning to his lonely cabin deep in the Rockies. Instead, he had stopped on the hillside overlooking the town. From there, he had watched every moment. The hopeful arrival, the cruel whispers, the rejection, the laughter. He did not know the young woman's name, but something about the way she stood, heartbroken, yet refusing to collapse beneath the crowd's mockery, stirred a memory buried deep inside him. Years earlier, his own wife had been mocked for her patched dress and empty pockets. He had never forgotten the sound of people laughing at someone who had done nothing wrong. The mountain man removed his hat. His weathered face remained expressionless, but his eyes betrayed quiet sorrow. After a long moment, he turned his horse toward the mountains. Yet as he rode into the towering pines, one thought refused to leave him. Some people crossed your path by chance. Others were sent there for a reason. And for the first time in many years, Elias Boone wondered if perhaps the Lord had placed a lonely stranger in his path, not to pity her, but to change both of their lives forever. The morning sun spilled over the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, painting the valley in soft shades of gold. Silver Creek slowly came to life. The blacksmith's hammer rang across the street. Store owners swept dust from their wooden porches. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. Men gathered outside the general store with steaming cups of coffee, sharing news about cattle prices, weather, and the newest topic everyone seemed eager to discuss. The mail-order bride. Every conversation found its way back to her. I heard Harold sent her away before she even unpacked. They say she cried all night. Poor thing. Poor Harold. Imagine expecting one woman and getting another. Laughter followed. Most people had already decided the story. Very few cared to learn the truth. Inside Martha Jenkins' small cottage on the edge of town, Clara sat at the kitchen table. The little house smelled of fresh biscuits and wildflower tea. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, warming the worn wooden floor. Martha placed another biscuit onto Clara's plate. "You need to eat." Clara smiled politely. "I'm trying. You've barely touched anything." "I know." For several moments, neither woman spoke. Finally, Martha sat beside her. "My dear, what are your plans now?" Clara lowered her eyes. "I honestly don't know." She reached into her small coin purse. Only 3 silver coins remained. "I have enough money for perhaps another day." Martha frowned. "The stage east won't leave for nearly 2 weeks. I couldn't afford the fare anyway. And staying. I cannot ask that of you." Martha reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You haven't asked. but I cannot become your burden. My husband passed 20 years ago. My children live far away. This little house has been lonely ever since. Clara's eyes softened. You've already shown me more kindness than I deserve. Martha smiled gently. No, child. You've simply met someone who remembers what kindness feels like. After breakfast, Clara insisted on helping. She washed every dish, swept the floor, folded blankets, even repaired a loose button on Martha's favorite apron before the older woman noticed it was missing. Martha watched quietly. This young woman wasn't lazy. She wasn't helpless. She simply needed someone willing to look beyond first impressions. You really can sew, Martha observed. My mother taught me. And cook. My father always said I baked better bread than the baker in Boston. Martha laughed. We'll have to test that claim. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Clara laughed too. It was only a small laugh, but it was enough to remind her that hope had not completely disappeared. By mid-morning, she set out to find work. If I can earn enough, she told Martha, perhaps I can remain here until I know what God wants me to do. She carried no pride, only determination. Her first stop was the hotel. The owner glanced at her briefly. I'm sorry. We've already hired someone. She nodded politely. I understand. At the laundry, she received the same answer. At the mercantile, we don't need help. At the schoolhouse, the position was filled last month. She walked from one building to another. Each rejection sounded almost identical. Sometimes, the employers were honest. Sometimes, they simply wanted to avoid hiring the woman everyone had been talking about. Word traveled quickly in small towns. By noon, her feet ached. Dust clung to the hem of her blue dress. Still, she refused to complain. She paused outside the church. The building stood quiet beneath a large cottonwood tree. Clara stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through the simple stained glass windows. She knelt in the front pew. No grand speech escaped her lips. Only one simple prayer. Lord, I don't understand. I believed you led me here. If I was wrong, please forgive me. If I was right, please help me see what you are doing. Silence answered. Yet somehow the silence felt peaceful rather than empty. She remained there for several minutes before rising again. At the same time, several miles above town, Elias Boone guided his horse down a narrow mountain trail. 2 large bundles of beaver pelts hung across the saddle. He had trapped them during the previous winter. Today he intended to trade them for flour, salt, lamp oil, coffee beans, and a few iron tools. His cabin sat nearly 20 miles from Silver Creek. He visited town only once every few weeks. Most people respected him. Few truly knew him. Some called him a mountain giant. Others called him a hermit. Children whispered stories that he could wrestle bears with his bare hands. Elias ignored them all. He preferred trees over gossip. He preferred rivers over crowded streets. Most of all, he preferred silence. Still, the image of the rejected young woman lingered in his thoughts. He had watched from the ridge until everyone else walked away. Even now he remembered how she stood with quiet dignity while others laughed. It reminded him too much of Sarah, his Sarah. Years had passed since she entered eternity. Yet grief had a strange way of making yesterday feel like this morning. He gently touched the plain gold wedding band hanging from a leather cord around his neck. I miss you, he whispered. The wind carried his words into the pines. Silver Creek looked much the same when Elias arrived. Only Sheriff Tom Dawson noticed him immediately. Morning, Boone. Elias tipped his hat. Tom, you hear what happened yesterday? I saw enough. The sheriff sighed. I've been lawman here 15 years. I've broken up gunfights, tracked cattle thieves, even chased out wolves. But sometimes people's tongues do more damage than bullets. Elias remained silent. Tom leaned against the hitching rail. That poor girl has nowhere to go. No family, no work, no money. Elias simply listened. Tom studied him carefully. You thinking what I'm thinking? No. Liar. Elias almost smiled. Almost. Tom chuckled. I know you better than anyone. When something troubles you, you stop talking. I barely talk anyway. Exactly. For the first time that morning, Elias allowed himself a small grin. After trading his pelts, Elias purchased supplies. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, a new kettle. As he loaded them onto his horse, something caught his eye across the street. Clara. She was carrying a basket of laundry for the hotel owner. Not because she had been hired, simply because the elderly woman struggled to carry it herself. After helping, Clara quietly continued walking. She expected nothing in return. The hotel owner called after her. Thank you, Clara smiled. You're welcome. Then she disappeared around the corner. Elias watched her until she was gone. People revealed themselves most clearly when no one expected a reward. Later that afternoon, he visited Martha Jenkins. She often traded homemade preserves for fresh venison. He knocked once. Come in. Martha opened the door. Well, I'll be. Elias Boone. You've arrived just in time. Just in time for what? She smiled knowingly. For pie. He stepped inside. The smell immediately caught his attention. Apple pie. Fresh from the oven. He removed his hat. I thought apples didn't grow this early. They don't. Our guest worked wonders with dried apples. Our guest. Martha stepped aside. Standing near the stove was Clara. She wore one of Martha's aprons. A small dusting of flour rested across her sleeve. She looked up nervously. Their eyes met for the first time. Elias noticed the scar. Then he noticed something else. Kind eyes. Tired eyes. Eyes that had cried recently, but also eyes that had not surrendered hope. Clara noticed something entirely different. The enormous mountain man filled the doorway. He stood well over 6 feet tall. His shoulders were broad from years of chopping timber. His hands were rough. His beard thick. He looked intimidating. Until he spoke. Good afternoon. His voice was calm, gentle, unexpectedly warm. Clara smiled. Good afternoon. Martha introduced them. Clara Whitmore. This is Elias Boone. The quietest man in Montana, Elias answered without missing a beat. I'm not that quiet. Both women laughed. It was likely the longest sentence anyone in town had heard him speak all week. They sat together over slices of pie. Conversation came slowly, not because anyone felt uncomfortable, because none of them enjoyed filling silence with empty words. Martha finally asked, So Elias, how's the mountain treating you? It still stands. She rolled her eyes. You've always been a great talker. Clara covered a smile with her hand. Elias looked toward her. You laughed. I did. I haven't laughed much lately. I'm glad you did. Their eyes met again. Neither looked away immediately. For reasons neither could explain, the room suddenly felt warmer. After pie, Martha stepped outside to gather herbs from her garden, leaving the two of them alone. Neither spoke for a moment. Finally, Elias asked, Can you cook? Clara blinked. Yes. So? Yes. Read? She looked puzzled. I read every day. He nodded once. I thought so. She waited for another question. Instead, he asked, Do you fear mountains? I've never lived in them. That's not what I asked. She considered carefully. I suppose I fear loneliness more. Elias looked down at his hands. So do I. The words hung quietly between them. Simple, honest, heavy with meaning. When Martha returned a few minutes later, she sensed something had changed. Neither Clara nor Elias had spoken many words. Yet somehow they seemed less like strangers. As the afternoon sun drifted lower, Elias rose to leave. He placed his hat back on his head. Then he turned toward Clara. I'll return tomorrow. She looked surprised. Why? His answer was as steady as the mountains themselves. "Because I have something important to ask you." He tipped his hat politely, then mounted his horse and disappeared toward the towering pines. Clara watched until he vanished among the trees. She turned to Martha. "What do you suppose he meant?" Martha smiled in a way that suggested she already knew. "I've known Elias Boone for nearly 20 years. He never says anything he doesn't mean. If he says he's coming back, he will." That evening, as darkness settled over Silver Creek, Clara stood outside beneath a sky filled with countless stars. She thought about the strange mountain man. She barely knew his name. Yet for the first time since arriving in Montana, someone had looked into her eyes before noticing the scar. She didn't know why that simple kindness lingered in her heart. High above the valley, Elias guided his horse home beneath the moonlight. The question forming in his mind seemed impossible, unreasonable, even foolish. He had lived alone for years. He had buried every dream of loving again beside two simple graves on a quiet mountain. Yet the more he prayed during the long ride home, the stronger the conviction became. Perhaps the Lord had not brought Clara Whitmore to Montana for Harold Granger. Perhaps he had brought her for a man who had stopped believing that his own story could begin again. Tomorrow, Elias Boone intended to ask a question that would astonish the entire territory. The first light of dawn spilled gently across the mountains. Mist drifted through the towering pine trees like quiet rivers floating above the earth. Birds greeted the morning with cheerful songs, while a cool breeze carried the scent of cedar, wildflowers, and fresh rain from the night before. Elias Boone had been awake for hours. He rarely slept late. Long before sunrise, he had finished feeding his mule, gathered fresh water from the nearby spring, and stacked another row of split firewood beside his cabin. Usually, work helped clear his mind. Today, it did not. His thoughts kept returning to the young woman in Silver Creek, Clara Whitmore. He could still see the pain in her eyes when Harold Granger rejected her before the entire town. He remembered how she had smiled anyway when Martha offered her kindness. Most of all, he remembered how naturally she laughed over a slice of apple pie. It had been a small laugh, but after years of silence in his own life, it had sounded like hope. Elias leaned against the porch railing and looked toward the distant valley. His cabin stood high above Silver Creek, surrounded by pine forests and mountain streams. It was simple, a sturdy log home built with his own hands many years earlier. The front porch overlooked a meadow where deer often grazed at sunrise. Behind the cabin stood a smokehouse, a small barn, a vegetable garden, and several fenced pastures where a handful of cattle wandered peacefully. It was not a grand ranch, but it was enough. Enough land, enough food, enough peace. Still, every evening the cabin felt far too quiet. The rocking chair beside the fireplace remained empty. Only one cup rested on the kitchen table. One voice echoed through the rooms. One pair of footsteps crossed the wooden floor. He had convinced himself that loneliness was simply part of his life now, until yesterday. Elias removed the leather cord from around his neck. The plain gold wedding ring, resting against his palm, caught the morning sunlight. He smiled sadly. "Sarah." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I never thought I'd speak these words." He looked toward the small hill behind the cabin, where two wooden crosses stood beneath an old pine tree. One marked the resting place of his wife. The other belonged to the infant son they had lost only days after birth. He slowly walked to the graves. Wildflowers bloomed around the simple wooden markers. He knelt quietly. "I made you a promise. I said there would never be another." His eyes filled with tears. "I kept that promise because I believed my heart was buried here beside yours." He lowered his head. "But yesterday, I saw someone standing alone the way you once stood. I remembered what it feels like when the whole world judges someone without knowing them. I don't know why the Lord placed her in my path, but I cannot ignore it." The morning breeze rustled through the pine branches. No voice answered him, only peace. After several moments, Elias stood. For the first time in years, The weight he carried seemed just a little lighter. He slipped the wedding band back onto the leather cord. Then he saddled his horse. He knew exactly where he was going. Meanwhile, inside Martha Jenkins' little cottage, Clara had also risen early. She insisted on helping before breakfast. By sunrise, she had already swept the floors, kneaded fresh bread dough, and watered Martha's tiny herb garden. Martha watched her from the porch with quiet admiration. "You certainly don't know how to sit still." Clara laughed softly. "My mother used to say, 'Idle hands make heavy hearts.' A wise woman. She was." The laughter faded. Clara looked toward the mountains. "I miss them. I know. I keep expecting to hear my father's footsteps in the hallway." Martha nodded. "Grief takes its time. It doesn't ask permission. It simply stays until it's ready to leave." Clara smiled sadly. "My mother used to say something similar." The older woman placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Then she was wise, too. They carried breakfast inside. Just as Martha poured coffee, a knock sounded at the door. 3 slow knocks. Firm. Patient. Martha smiled before opening it. I wondered how long it would take. Standing outside was Elias Boone. He held his hat in one hand. The morning sun framed his broad shoulders, making him appear even taller than Clara remembered. Yet there was nothing threatening about his expression, only quiet determination. "Morning, Martha." "Morning, Elias." He glanced toward Clara. "Miss Whitmore." "Good morning." Martha stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The cabin felt unusually quiet. Even the kettle seemed to whistle more softly. Elias accepted a cup of coffee. He thanked Martha. Then he sat at the table. For nearly a full minute, no one spoke. Clara wondered if perhaps he had forgotten whatever he intended to ask. Finally, Elias looked directly at her. "I hope you don't mind a plain question." She folded her hands calmly. "I'd rather have plain questions than fancy ones." A faint smile crossed his face. "So would I." He paused, then asked the same questions as the day before. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Sew?" "Yes." "Care for chickens?" "I've done it." "Milk a cow?" "I can learn." "Read the Bible?" "Every evening." "Work from sunrise until dark?" "If necessary." He nodded once. "I thought so." Clara waited. Surely more questions would follow. Instead, he asked one that caught everyone by surprise. "Would you ever be ashamed to live in a log cabin?" She blinked. "No. I've lived in much smaller places." "Would you mind snow 6 months of the year?" "I've never seen that much snow." "You'll either love it or hate it." She smiled. "I suppose I'll discover which." Elias looked down into his coffee. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried unusual hesitation. "I've lived alone 7 years. My wife died. So did our son. I'm sorry. So am I." Another silence settled over the room. Then Elias lifted his eyes. "I don't speak well. I never have. So I'll simply say what I came to say." He stood. Every word that followed was slow, carefully chosen. "I don't know much about city life. I don't dance. I don't own fine clothes. I don't have polished manners. But I own my land. I built my home. I work hard. I tell the truth, and I believe a husband should honor his wife every day God allows him to." Clara listened without interrupting. "I watched what happened yesterday. You were treated unfairly. I won't pretend I understand everything, but I know this. No woman deserves to stand alone while people laugh." His voice softened. "If you'll have me, I'd like to be your husband." The room fell completely silent. Even Martha stared at him. Clara's heart pounded. She had expected many things. Not this. "You?" She searched for words. "You're asking me to marry you?" "Yes." "You hardly know me." "I know enough." "How?" "I've watched how you treat people. You thanked everyone who showed kindness. You worked without expecting payment. You prayed instead of complaining. You laughed yesterday after every reason not to. He met her eyes. Character tells me more than beauty ever could. Tears immediately filled Clara's eyes. No one had ever spoken to her that way. Still, she could not answer immediately. Elias, I appreciate your kindness, but surely this isn't pity. His reply came without hesitation. It isn't. If it were pity, I'd offer money. I'm offering my name. Those words settled deep into Clara's heart. Martha quietly stood. I believe you two deserve some privacy. She slipped outside, gently closing the door behind her. Only Clara and Elias remained. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt important. Clara looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, she could see the mountains rising into the clouds. If I said yes, what would life be like? Elias answered honestly. It would be hard. The winters are long. We work every day. I don't own many luxuries. The nearest neighbor lives 5 miles away. But, he smiled gently, you'll never wonder whether you're wanted. A tear rolled down Clara's cheek. That simple promise touched a place no grand speech ever could. She looked at him carefully. May I ask one question? Of course. Would you ever be embarrassed to stand beside me in town? Elias looked genuinely puzzled. Why would I be? She touched the scar on her cheek. This. He studied her face for several moments. Finally, he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. I noticed your scar, but it was the last thing about you that stayed in my mind. What stayed was your courage. Clara lowered her head. She quietly wiped away another tear. No one had ever looked beyond the scar before. No one. May I have one day to pray? She asked softly. Elias nodded. You may have as many as you need. He reached for his hat. I don't want an answer given from fear. I want one given freely. As he opened the door, Clara spoke again. Elias? He turned. If I choose this life, will you promise me something? Anything within my power. Never stop telling me the truth. He smiled. I don't know how to do anything else. With that, he stepped outside. The rest of the day passed slowly. Clara walked beyond the edge of town until she found a quiet hill overlooking the valley. She sat beneath a lone cottonwood tree, with her Bible open on her lap. The breeze turned the pages until they rested on the Book of Ruth. Her eyes fell upon familiar words. Where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people. She smiled through fresh tears. She remembered her mother reading that passage when Clara was still a little girl. Back then, she imagined a wedding filled with flowers, music, and family. Life had taken a different path, yet perhaps God's plans often look different from our own. She closed her Bible and prayed, Lord, I came to Montana believing I was following the future you prepared. Yesterday, I thought everything had fallen apart. But today, you placed another path before me. I don't know this man well, but I know peace when you give it. If this is your will, please make my heart certain. The wind gently stirred the tall grass around her. For the first time since arriving in Montana, fear began giving way to peace. As evening settled over Silver Creek, Elias rode home through the mountains beneath a sky painted orange and crimson. He expected nothing. Perhaps Clara would refuse. Perhaps she would return east. Perhaps he would never see her again. He had asked honestly. The answer now rested in God's hands. Back in town, Clara stood outside Martha's cottage, watching the first stars appear. A quiet smile touched her lips. Tomorrow, she would give Elias Boone her answer. Neither of them knew that, before another week had passed, the entire town of Silver Creek would gather once again. Not to laugh at an unwanted bride, but to witness the beginning of one of the greatest love stories the Montana mountains would ever remember. The sun had barely climbed above the eastern hills when Clara Whitmore awoke. For several long moments, she remained still beneath the handmade quilt Martha had lovingly spread over the small guest bed. The cottage was quiet. Outside, birds welcomed another Montana morning, and somewhere beyond the window, a rooster announced the beginning of a new day. But inside Clara's heart, another beginning waited. She had spent most of the previous evening in prayer. She had read every passage of scripture that had brought her comfort throughout her life. She had remembered her parents' gentle voices. She had replayed every word Elias Boone had spoken. Not once had he praised her appearance. Not once had he tried to impress her with promises of wealth. He had simply offered truth, hard work, a home, his name, and one promise that echoed in her heart even now. You'll never wonder whether you're wanted. No one had ever promised her that before. She quietly rose, dressed in her simple blue cotton dress, and stepped outside. Morning mist drifted across the valley. The mountains stood silent beneath the pale sky. Clara clasped her Bible against her chest. "Lord," she whispered, "if this is the road you've prepared, let me walk it with courage." A deep peace settled over her heart. The fear that had followed her from Boston was finally beginning to loosen its grip. She knew her answer. Inside the kitchen, Martha was already kneading bread. She looked up the moment Clara entered. "You've made your decision." It wasn't a question. Clara smiled. "How did you know?" Martha chuckled. "When the Lord gives someone peace, it shows on their face." Clara sat beside her. "I've decided to marry Elias." The older woman's hands stopped moving. A slow smile spread across her weathered face. "I hoped you'd say that. You're not surprised?" "Child, I've known Elias Boone for nearly 20 years. He doesn't chase foolish ideas. If he asked you to marry him, he prayed before he spoke." Clara looked down at her folded hands. "I hardly know him." "No, but sometimes you learn more from one honest conversation than from years of empty words." Martha reached across the table. "I believe he'll treasure you." Those simple words brought tears to Clara's eyes. She had spent so much of her life feeling overlooked that the thought of being treasured seemed almost impossible. Later that morning, the familiar sound of horse hooves echoed outside the cottage. 3 gentle knocks followed. Martha opened the door. Elias stood quietly on the porch, hat in hand. He looked exactly as he had the day before. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn buckskin, with kind eyes beneath the brim of his hat. Yet Clara noticed something different. He looked nervous. It was almost impossible to imagine a man who had survived blizzards, mountain lions, and lonely winters, feeling nervous. But he did. His hands shifted slightly as he waited. "I came for your answer," he said softly. Clara stepped onto the porch. The cool morning breeze lifted a loose strand of her brown hair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she smiled. "Yes," only one word, but it changed both of their lives forever. Elias blinked. "Yes?" She laughed quietly. "Yes, I'll marry you." For the first time in many years, the mountain man seemed completely speechless. His eyes filled with quiet emotion. He looked toward the sky for just a moment before lowering his head. "Thank you," he whispered. Clara wasn't certain whether he was speaking to her or to God. Perhaps both. He smiled. It wasn't a broad smile. It was small, gentle, but it reached his eyes. "I'll spend every day earning that answer." News traveled through Silver Creek faster than wildfire, across dry grass. Before noon, nearly everyone knew. The rejected bride is marrying Boone. "The mountain hermit?" "I give it 6 months. She'll run back east before winter." Laughter drifted from the saloon porch. Several ranch hands leaned against the hitching rail, amused by the latest gossip. One man shook his head. "I suppose when no one else wants you, you settle for the mountain man." Another added, "Maybe Boone finally got tired of talking to his mule." More laughter followed. Not everyone joined in. Sheriff Tom Dawson overheard the conversation as he crossed the street. He stopped. "You boys ought to be ashamed." One cowboy shrugged. "We're only joking." Tom looked each man in the eye. "A joke isn't funny when someone else has to carry the hurt." Silence settled over the group. The sheriff continued walking without another word. Harold Granger heard the news while inspecting cattle. At first he laughed. Then he frowned. "She's marrying Boone." His foreman nodded. "So they say." Harold stared across the valley toward the mountains. He had expected Clara to leave town quietly. Instead, she was staying. For reasons he couldn't explain, the thought unsettled him. He told himself it didn't matter. Yet something about Elias Boone choosing the woman he had rejected planted an uncomfortable seed deep inside his heart. The wedding took place only 4 days later. There were no fancy invitations, no expensive decorations, no orchestra, only faith. The little white church at the edge of town stood quietly beneath a clear blue sky. Wildflowers lined the path leading to the front door. Inside, sunlight streamed through simple stained glass windows, filling the sanctuary with warm colors. Martha helped Clara prepare in the small room behind the church. Her wedding dress was not new. It had belonged to Martha's daughter years earlier. The lace had yellowed slightly with age. Several seams needed repairing. Clara had quietly mended them herself. When she looked into the mirror, she smiled. It wasn't the beautiful gowns she had once imagined as a little girl. It was better, because every stitch represented kindness. Martha gently fastened the last button. "My dear, you look lovely." Clara touched the scar on her cheek. "You really think so?" "I know so." The older woman gently cupped Clara's face. "Any man who only sees that scar isn't worthy of seeing the woman wearing it." Clara embraced her tightly. "Thank you for everything." Meanwhile, Elias stood at the front of the church beside Sheriff Tom Dawson, who had agreed to serve as his witness. Tom adjusted Elias's collar. "You've chopped down trees bigger than this church. You've faced grizzly bears. You've crossed mountain passes during blizzards. So why are you shaking?" Elias looked at his hands. "I don't know." Tom laughed warmly. "Because this matters." It does. More than Elias could ever explain. The church doors opened. Every head turned. Clara stepped inside. A hush settled over the room. Even those who had mocked her days earlier could not deny the quiet grace with which she carried herself. She walked slowly down the aisle, carrying a small bouquet of mountain flowers Martha had gathered at sunrise. Elias watched her approach. He noticed the scar. Then he forgot it entirely. All he saw was the woman who had chosen to trust him. When Clara reached the altar, their eyes met. Neither looked away. Pastor Samuel Reed smiled kindly. "We are gathered today not because of chance, but because God often writes stories no one expects." The ceremony was simple. The vows were even simpler. Pastor Reed turned toward Elias. "Do you promise before God to love, honor, protect, and cherish this woman for as long as you both shall live?" "I do." Without hesitation. Then he faced Clara. "Do you promise before God to love, honor, support, and remain faithful to this man through every season of life?" She smiled. "I do." Pastor Reed nodded. "Elias, would you like to say anything to your bride?" The mountain man hesitated. Crowds had never been his strength. Words came slowly. He reached into his pocket and unfolded a small piece of paper. "I wrote something." His hands trembled slightly. Then he began. "Clara, I don't own a mansion. I don't have riches. I can't promise an easy life. There will be winters when snow covers the cabin roof. There will be mornings before sunrise and nights after sunset when we'll still be working. There will be seasons that test us. But if God gives me strength, you will never face them alone." His voice softened. "I'll never speak to you with cruelty. I'll never let you wonder if you're enough. I'll thank God every day He trusted me with your heart." By the time he finished, tears filled Clara's eyes. Several people in the church quietly wiped away their own. Even Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat and looked toward the ceiling. Pastor Reed smiled. "Clara, would you like to answer?" She looked directly at Elias. "When I arrived in Silver Creek, I believed no one wanted me. The crowd saw a scar. You saw a person. The world measured what I looked like. You measured who I was. I cannot promise perfection, But I promise this. I will build our home with faith. I will pray beside you. I will laugh with you. I will stand beside you. And no matter what tomorrow brings, you'll never walk through it alone. Silence filled the church. Not the silence of discomfort. The silence that follows something true. Pastor Reed lifted his hands. By the authority given to me before God and this territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Elias hesitated, almost shyly. He gently placed one hand against Clara's cheek, careful not to hide the scar she had spent years trying to hide herself. Then he kissed her forehead, before softly kissing her lips. It was tender, respectful, filled with quiet devotion. The congregation applauded, not loudly, but sincerely. Even some who had once laughed found themselves smiling. After the ceremony, the church lawn filled with neighbors, carrying homemade pies, fresh bread, smoked venison, jars of preserves, and baskets overflowing with vegetables. Children chased one another through the grass, while musicians played lively fiddle tunes beneath the cottonwood trees. Sheriff Dawson raised a cup of coffee. To the bride nobody expected, and the mountain man wise enough to recognize treasure. Laughter, and this time genuine warmth, rose from the gathering. Yet not every heart celebrated. Standing across the street, Harold Granger watched from the shadows of the livery stable. He saw Clara laughing with Elias. He saw the peace on her face. It was a peace he had never noticed when she first stepped from the stagecoach. For the first time since rejecting her, doubt whispered into his heart. Had he judged too quickly? He pushed the thought away, yet it refused to leave. As the afternoon faded into evening, Clara climbed into the simple wagon beside her husband. The townspeople waved goodbye. Martha hugged her one last time. "You'll always have a home here. So will you," Clara replied. Elias helped his bride settle onto the wagon seat. He gathered the reins. "Ready?" She looked toward the mountains. The towering peaks no longer seemed frightening. They looked like home, waiting to be discovered. She smiled. "I am." The wagon rolled slowly away from Silver Creek. Dust rose behind the wheels as husband and wife began the long journey into the wilderness. Neither of them noticed two riders watching from a distant ridge. One was a stranger, whose face remained hidden beneath a black hat. The other carried a rifle across his saddle. Their quiet conversation disappeared into the evening wind, but their eyes never left the newlyweds. Far ahead, deep in the mountains, danger had already begun moving toward the peaceful life Elias and Clara dreamed of building. Neither of them knew that, before the first snow fell, their faith, their marriage, and their courage would be tested in ways neither could imagine. The wagon creaked steadily as Elias Boone guided the horses farther into the mountains. Behind them, the little town of Silver Creek slowly disappeared beneath a blanket of evening light. Ahead lay miles of towering pine forests, winding rivers, rocky trails, and snow-capped peaks stretching toward the horizon. Clara sat quietly beside her new husband. The gold wedding band on her finger still felt unfamiliar. Every now and then she glanced at it, smiling to herself. Only a week earlier, she had stood alone in the middle of a dusty street, wondering if she had made the greatest mistake of her life by traveling west. Now she was beginning a journey beside a man who had chosen her without hesitation. Neither of them spoke much. Neither needed to. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the quiet understanding that sometimes the best conversations required no words at all. After nearly an hour, Elias pointed toward a distant ridge. "See that peak?" Clara nodded. "It catches the first sunlight every morning. It reminds me that every day starts with another chance." She smiled. "You've thought about that often." "I have." She looked at him curiously. "You don't speak many words." "No. But when you do, they matter." A shy smile appeared beneath his beard. "My father used to say words are like arrows. You can't call them back once they've left the bow." Clara laughed softly. "I think I'd have liked your father." "You would have." The road gradually narrowed until it became little more than a winding trail through dense pine trees. The horses slowed naturally as they climbed higher into the mountains. Everywhere Clara looked, she found beauty unlike anything she had ever imagined. Crystal-clear streams rushed over smooth stones. Wildflowers painted the meadows with splashes of purple, yellow, and blue. Deer lifted their heads from the tall grass before quietly disappearing into the trees. An eagle circled high overhead. "It feels untouched," Clara whispered. Elias nodded. "It mostly is. Do you ever get lonely here?" He considered the question carefully. "I used to." "What changed?" He glanced toward her. "I'll let you know." She smiled. "I suppose that's fair." As evening settled over the mountains, the trail curved around a rocky hillside. Suddenly, Elias slowed the horses. "We're here." Clara looked ahead. Nestled in a peaceful valley beside a clear mountain stream stood a sturdy log cabin. Smoke drifted gently from the stone chimney. A split-rail fence surrounded a vegetable garden overflowing with beans, squash, carrots, onions, and cabbage. Beyond the garden stood a red barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and several fenced pastures where a handful of cattle grazed peacefully. Apple trees lined the edge of the property. A small footbridge crossed the stream, leading to a meadow filled with wildflowers. The cabin itself was simple, yet every log had been carefully shaped, every stone placed with care. The porch wrapped around the front, holding 2 handmade rocking chairs. Clara stared in amazement. "You built this?" Elias nodded. "Every piece." She stepped down from the wagon. Running her hand across one of the massive pine logs, she whispered, "It feels loved." He looked slightly embarrassed. "I wanted it to last." "It will." She turned slowly in every direction. The place wasn't grand. It wasn't luxurious. Yet something about it immediately felt like home. Inside, the cabin glowed warmly in the fading sunlight. A large stone fireplace stood at the center of the main room. Books filled handmade shelves along one wall. A sturdy dining table rested beneath the front window. Quilts covered the beds. Copper pots hung neatly above the kitchen hearth. Everything was clean. Everything had a place. Clara looked surprised. "I expected—" She stopped herself. "What?" "I don't know. More dust." Elias chuckled quietly. "I clean every Saturday." "You clean?" "I live here." She laughed. "I suppose that's a reasonable answer." He carried her trunk into the bedroom. "This room is yours." She looked around. "Our room." He nodded. "Our room." Then, almost awkwardly, he added, "If you'd rather sleep alone for a while, I can use the loft." Clara looked at him with gratitude. "You'd do that?" "I don't want you to feel rushed." She gently touched his arm. "Thank you." It was another small act of kindness. Another reminder that this marriage was being built on respect rather than demands. After unpacking, Clara insisted on helping prepare supper. She found flour, beans, salt pork, fresh herbs growing just outside the back door. Together, they worked quietly. Without planning it, they moved naturally around one another. When Clara reached for a pan, Elias had already placed it nearby. When Elias chopped vegetables, Clara stirred the stew. It felt surprisingly easy. At supper, they bowed their heads. Elias prayed, "Lord, thank you for bringing Clara safely home." Home. The single word filled Clara's eyes with tears. No one had called any place her home since her parents died. She quietly whispered, "Amen." The next morning began before sunrise. A gentle knock sounded on the bedroom door. "Clara?" She opened it. Elias stood holding 2 steaming mugs. "Coffee?" She smiled. "I think I'm beginning to like mountain mornings." He handed her 1 mug. "They begin early. I noticed." Outside, dawn painted the mountains pink and gold. The valley slowly awakened. Birds sang from every tree. The cattle stirred in the pasture. Mist floated above the stream. Clara stood beside Elias on the porch. "It feels like the whole world is praying." He looked at her thoughtfully. I've never heard anyone describe it that way. It does. He listened. For the first time in years, he truly heard the valley again. Life settled into a gentle rhythm. Each morning they prayed together before beginning their work. Clara learned how to gather eggs, milk the cows, feed chickens, tend the vegetable garden, bake bread inside the wood-fired oven. She made curtains for the cabin windows. She sewed new blankets from old pieces of cloth. She planted flowers beside the porch. Little by little, the cabin changed, not because it needed repair, because it was finally becoming a family home. Elias watched quietly. One evening he returned from repairing a fence. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen table. New curtains danced gently in the breeze. The rocking chairs now held handmade cushions. The cabin somehow felt warmer. He smiled. "You've changed everything." Clara looked worried. "Too much?" He shook his head. "No, you've made it alive." Weeks passed. The people of Silver Creek occasionally visited. Sheriff Tom Dawson stopped by with news from town. Martha arrived carrying jars of raspberry preserves. Neighboring ranchers traded vegetables for fresh venison. Slowly, the couple became known throughout the valley for their hospitality. No traveler left hungry. No child left without a cookie tucked into a pocket. No widow left without extra firewood during cold evenings. One afternoon, Martha pulled Clara aside while Elias repaired a wagon wheel. "My dear, you've done something remarkable." Clara looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Elias smiles now. "I've known that man nearly 20 years. He rarely smiled after Sarah passed. But every time he looks at you, I see hope." Clara glanced toward her husband. He was laughing with 2 neighborhood boys while teaching them how to carve fishing hooks from cedar. She smiled. "I think he's given me even more hope than I've given him." Late one afternoon, Elias suggested a walk. "I want to show you something." They climbed a narrow trail behind the cabin. The path wound through tall pines until it reached a quiet hill overlooking the valley. Beneath an ancient tree stood 2 simple wooden crosses. Clara immediately understood. Without speaking, she slipped her hand into his. "This is Sarah." He touched the first cross gently. "And our little Samuel." His voice broke. "I've never brought anyone here." Clara knelt beside the graves. She didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She simply bowed her head in silent prayer. Several minutes passed. Finally, Elias whispered, "I was afraid." "Of what?" "That loving again would somehow dishonor them." Clara looked up. "It doesn't. It honors the love God gave you. You didn't stop loving Sarah. You simply kept living. And I believe she'd be thankful you didn't spend the rest of your life alone." Tears rolled slowly down Elias's weathered face. He had carried that guilt for 7 long years. Those simple words loosened a burden he had never shared with another soul. He quietly squeezed Clara's hand. "Thank you." As summer slowly gave way to early autumn, the valley flourished. Their harvest filled the smokehouse. The cattle grew healthy. Their marriage deepened through countless ordinary moments. Working side by side, reading scripture by the fireplace, watching sunsets from the porch, laughing over burnt biscuits, sharing dreams they had once believed were gone forever. Then, one crisp afternoon, Sheriff Dawson rode up the trail much faster than usual. Dust covered both horse and rider. His expression was serious. "Elias, what is it?" Tom dismounted quickly. "Cattle have been disappearing from several ranches." Elias frowned. "Wolves?" Tom shook his head. "No. Men. Cattle thieves. They've been moving through the territory. They strike at night. They leave almost no trail." Elias looked toward his own pasture. Tom followed his gaze. "I'm warning every rancher in these mountains. Lock your livestock. Keep your rifle close. They're getting bolder." After the sheriff rode away, silence settled over the valley once more. Clara noticed Elias studying the distant tree line. "You think they'll come here?" "I hope not. But hope isn't a plan." That evening, Elias checked every fence twice. He secured the barn doors, loaded fresh cartridges into his old Winchester, hung a lantern outside the cabin. Clara watched quietly from the porch. For the first time since arriving in the mountains, she sensed a shadow creeping toward their peaceful life. After supper, they knelt together beside the fireplace. Elias prayed with unusual seriousness. "Lord, you've blessed us beyond anything I deserve. If trouble is coming, give me wisdom. Give me courage, and whatever happens, help me protect the family you've entrusted to me." Clara gently reached for his hand. She realized then that marriage was not only sharing joyful days, it was standing together when uncertainty appeared. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Far beyond the valley, hidden among the dark trees, 3 mounted riders stopped on a rocky overlook. Their leaders studied the Boone homestead through a spyglass. Smoke curled peacefully from the chimney. Cattle grazed below. Lantern light glowed warmly inside the cabin. The man lowered the spyglass and smiled. "A lonely mountain man," he muttered. "Looks like an easy target." None of them knew that the quiet couple living below possessed something stronger than rifles, stronger than fear, and stronger than greed. They possessed unshakable faith. Before the first snow covered the mountains, that faith would be tested like never before. The first snow arrived earlier than anyone expected. It drifted gently through the Montana mountains during the night, covering the valley in a blanket of white. By sunrise, every pine branch sparkled beneath the morning light, and the Boone homestead looked as though it had been wrapped in quiet peace. From the cabin chimney, thin ribbons of smoke curled into the cold sky. Inside, Clara stood beside the wood stove, humming softly, while fresh bread baked in the oven. The warm scent of cinnamon and yeast filled every corner of the cabin. Elias entered carrying another armful of firewood. He stamped the snow from his boots before setting the logs beside the fireplace. "You've been outside too long," Clara said. "I've only been checking the fences." "You've checked them 3 times since sunrise." He smiled faintly. "And I'll probably check them again." She walked over and brushed a few snowflakes from his beard. "You've been worried, ever since Sheriff Dawson warned us." "I know, but worry won't keep cattle thieves away." "No, it won't." She took both of his rough hands into hers, but neither will carrying the burden alone. For a moment they simply stood together in the warmth of their little cabin. Months earlier they had been strangers. Now they understood one another without many words. That afternoon, Sheriff Tom Dawson rode into the valley once again. This time his horse was lathered with sweat. His face looked grim. Before he even reached the porch, Elias knew something had happened. Tom climbed down quickly. "They struck last night." Elias frowned. "Whose ranch?" "The Millers." "How many?" 23 head. Clara covered her mouth. "Is anyone hurt?" Tom nodded slowly. "Old Jacob Miller tried to stop them. He was thrown from his horse. He'll live, but barely." Silence settled between them. Tom looked toward the distant mountains. "They're getting bolder. They know winter makes people desperate." Elias looked at Clara. "I'll need to help." She already knew. "You should." Tom nodded. "We're gathering every rancher tomorrow morning. We'll track them together." That evening the cabin felt unusually quiet. Snow tapped softly against the windows. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Yet neither Clara nor Elias spoke very much. Finally Clara broke the silence. "May I ask something?" "Always." "Are you afraid?" Elias stared into the flames. "I'd be foolish not to be." She reached across the table. "I am too." He looked at her. "What frightens you most?" She answered honestly. "Losing you." The words lingered between them. Elias moved beside her. He gently placed his hand over hers. "I can't promise nothing will happen." "I know, but I can promise I'll come home if God allows it." She smiled through gathering tears. "And I'll be praying until you do." Before dawn the next morning, nearly 30 ranchers gathered outside the Silver Creek Church. The air was bitterly cold. Steam rose from the horses' noses. Sheriff Dawson stood before the men. "We believe the thieves are hiding somewhere beyond Black Pine Ridge. We'll split into 3 groups. We search until we find them." Harold Granger stood near the back. His ranch had suffered too. 10 cattle had disappeared, only 2 nights earlier. He glanced toward Elias. For several moments he hesitated. Then he quietly walked over. "Elias." The mountain man turned. Harold lowered his eyes. "I owe you an apology." Elias remained silent. Harold continued. "I judged your wife. I judged both of you. I was wrong." The words were difficult for him. Clara's kindness during the month since the wedding had haunted him. She had never spoken bitterly about what happened. Instead, every time they met in town, she greeted him with the same gentle smile she offered everyone else. Harold shook his head. "I don't deserve forgiveness." Elias studied him for a long moment. Then he simply extended his hand. "Help us bring the cattle home." Harold stared. "That's all?" "It's enough." Harold grasped his hand tightly. Years of pride quietly began melting away. The search lasted 3 days. Snow made travel difficult. The mountains hid countless narrow passes and forgotten trails. Several times they found hoofprints only for the wind to erase them hours later. On the 3rd evening, Elias noticed something others missed. A raven circled repeatedly above one distant ridge. He frowned. "That's strange." Tom followed his gaze. "What is?" "Ravens gather where people leave food." The sheriff looked through his spyglass. "I don't see anything." "You won't. They're hidden." But the birds know. Within an hour they quietly climbed the ridge. There, tucked inside a narrow valley invisible from below, stood the thieves' camp. More than 60 stolen cattle grazed inside makeshift fences. 5 armed men sat around a fire. Sheriff Dawson whispered, "We've found them." The lawmen and ranchers surrounded the camp before sunrise. Tom stepped forward. "Throw down your weapons." For one heartbeat, everything stood still. Then one outlaw fired. Chaos erupted. Horses bolted. Men shouted. Rifles echoed through the valley. Elias pulled one frightened ranch hand behind a fallen log just before another bullet struck the tree. "Stay down!" The young man nodded, trembling. Another outlaw attempted to escape on horseback. Harold rode after him. The chase disappeared into the trees. Meanwhile, Elias noticed something else. One frightened horse had broken loose. It raced directly toward Sheriff Dawson, who had slipped on the icy ground. Without thinking, Elias lunged forward. He shoved Tom aside just as the horse thundered past. The sheriff crashed into the snow. Elias struck the ground hard. The horse missed him by only inches. Moments later, the remaining outlaws surrendered. The battle ended almost as quickly as it had begun. No innocent lives were lost. Every stolen animal was recovered. Sheriff Dawson slowly stood. He looked at Elias with deep gratitude. "You just saved my life." Elias brushed snow from his coat. "You'd have done the same." Tom smiled. "I would." By the time the ranchers returned to Silver Creek, the entire town had gathered. Children cheered as the cattle were driven back through the streets. Church bells rang. Families embraced. The long weeks of fear were finally over. Clara stood searching every rider until she saw Elias. The moment he dismounted, she hurried toward him. Without caring who watched, she wrapped both arms around him. "I was so worried." "I'm home." She stepped back. A bruise darkened his forehead. His coat had been torn. She gently touched his face. "You're hurt." "I've had worse." She smiled through tears. "I'm still going to fuss over you." Elias laughed. "I expected nothing less." That evening, the townspeople gathered inside the church. Pastor Samuel Reed stood before the congregation. "Tonight we thank God, not only for protecting our families, but for reminding us that courage often wears quiet clothes." He looked toward Elias and Clara. When Clara first stepped off the stagecoach, many of us looked at her through the wrong eyes, heads slowly lowered throughout the sanctuary. Pastor Reed continued. We saw a scar. God saw a daughter. We saw disappointment. God saw a blessing. We laughed. He was already writing a miracle. The church remained silent. Sheriff Dawson stood. I've worn this badge for 18 years. I've seen brave men, but I've never seen greater strength than what this family has shown. He turned toward Clara. Mrs. Boone, your kindness changed this town. You forgave people who never earned it. You welcomed strangers. You reminded us what real beauty looks like. Many people quietly wiped away tears. Old Martha smiled proudly from the front pew. Several days later, Harold Granger rode into the mountains alone. He stopped outside the Boone cabin, carrying 2 young apple trees in the back of his wagon. Clara welcomed him with warm bread and coffee. He removed his hat. I brought these. She looked puzzled. Apple trees. My mother always said apple trees outlive the people who plant them. He swallowed. I thought perhaps your children might one day enjoy them. Clara smiled warmly. Then let's plant them together. For the next 2 hours, Harold, Elias, and Clara worked side by side in the frozen ground. No one mentioned the painful past. They didn't need to. Forgiveness had already done its work. The years passed gently. The little cabin became known throughout the territory. Travelers called it the house on the mountain. No one in need was ever turned away. Hungry strangers always found a hot meal waiting. Lost children found safety by the fireplace. Widows received firewood every winter. Orphans discovered Christmas gifts mysteriously left on their porches. No one knew that many of those gifts came from Clara and Elias during quiet nights when no one was watching. 5 years later, laughter echoed through the valley once more. Not from strangers, from children. 2 little boys raced through the meadow, chasing butterflies, while their younger sister tried desperately to keep up. Clara laughed from the porch. Ethan! Slow down! The boys only laughed harder. Elias stepped beside his wife. They have your energy. They have your stubbornness. He chuckled. Probably. Their youngest daughter toddled across the porch, carrying a tiny wooden horse Elias had carved for her. She climbed into his lap without saying a word. He kissed the top of her head. Years ago he had believed he would never again hear children laughing outside his home. Now the sound filled every corner of the valley. One autumn evening, nearly 10 years after Clara first arrived in Silver Creek, she and Elias climbed the familiar hill behind the cabin. The old pine tree still stood faithfully over Sarah and little Samuel's graves. Fresh wildflowers rested beside each wooden cross. Clara gently knelt. We never forget them, she whispered. Elias nodded. We never will. He looked toward the valley below. Smoke rose peacefully from dozens of cabins. Fields stretched golden beneath the setting sun. Children played near the stream. The apple trees Harold had planted years earlier now stood tall and full of fruit. Elias smiled quietly. You know, what? The town used to laugh when they saw you. She laughed softly. I remember. They said no one would ever choose you. She slipped her hand into his. They were wrong. No. He looked at her with the same tenderness he had shown the day he proposed. They weren't wrong about one thing. She raised an eyebrow. What's that? You weren't chosen by just anyone. You were chosen exactly where you belonged. Tears filled Clara's eyes. So were you. They stood together, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. The valley glowed with peaceful evening light. The scar on Clara's cheek had never disappeared. It had simply become invisible beside the joy shining in her face. Long after they were gone, people continued telling the story. Not about the wealthy rancher, not about the thieves, not even about the mountain man. They told the story of the unwanted mail-order bride who arrived with nothing but faith, kindness, and courage. The woman everyone laughed at. The woman one quiet mountain man truly saw. The woman whose forgiving heart transformed an entire community. And whenever young couples in Silver Creek asked what made a marriage last through storms, hard winters, sorrow, and joy, The oldest people in town always gave the same answer. Choose someone who sees your heart before your face. Because beauty fades, wealth comes and goes, strength weakens with age. But a love built on faith, truth, sacrifice, forgiveness, and unwavering devotion grows stronger with every passing season. And in a quiet valley beneath the Montana mountains, that kind of love became the greatest legacy of all. The end. Moral lesson. The world often measures people by appearance, status, or first impressions, but God measures the heart. Rejection can become the doorway to a greater purpose, and kindness has the power to transform not only one life, but an entire community. True love is not finding someone who is perfect, it is finding someone who chooses you every day, sees your worth beyond outward appearances, and walks beside you through every season of life, with faith, grace, and unwavering